Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizengauzen. Today is October 16th, and there are a lot of important news stories in this episode. A series of high-profile statements from Donald Trump. India promises not to buy Russian oil. Ukrainians are preparing for an offensive. And in Chernihiv, a park will be named after Donald Trump. And in Russia, they've come up with a way to make Russian women have more children. Meanwhile, the president of Syria is demanding that Putin hand over Assad, and Moscow doesn't know what to do about it. Finland is ready to hide the entire population of the country underground and is issuing a warning. Russia is preparing for the second phase of aggression and the cyclical story of maniacs and murderers who have become war heroes in Russia. All this and more. Today's episode will have a lot of interesting things. So if you're new to this channel, subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Several important statements from Donald Trump. My friend, Indian Prime Minister Modi, assured me that India will not buy Russian oil. Donald Trump made this statement. And the second piece of news is that Indian refineries are preparing to reduce their purchases of Russian oil. And Trump added that this is still going on now, but it will end soon. Well, yes and no, not exactly. Yesterday I mentioned that India is reducing its purchases, Russian oil to state-owned refineries, but is almost proportionally increasing purchases for private refineries. So if something changes in this case, then yes, that's true. It's like India decided they're the smartest, right, Prime Minister Modi? I actually remember when Modi was in Moscow visiting Putin, and that visit, well, first of all, we organized some rather strange entertainment there. I mean, Putin and Modi went to some field where a woman in a kokoshnik was leading a horse around to the music of "I'll go out into the field at night with my horse." That was the entertainment. I watched it and thought, what kind of nonsense is this? But Modi ended his visit early because on that very same day, Putin launched devastating missile strikes on Kyiv. Tragically, a missile hit the largest hospital in Ukraine, specifically for children with cancer, located right there in Kyiv. Okhmatit is a hospital where children with cancer sometimes undergo treatment together with their parents. And so the missile struck and Modi left Moscow ahead of schedule. Well, I think, it would be really inappropriate to stay after such an event. But then when I saw Putin, Modi and Xi Jinping laughing and hugging in Beijing, it became clear that politics is a cynical business. So I think Modi just did it for appearances, like, yes, let's show respect. The situation is complicated. Putin acted inappropriately, but of course, later we'll buy even more of their oil. So that's how it is. By the way, you often hear the phrase, more than half the world supports Russia on Russian channels. Do you know what they mean by that? They think that India and China are their allies, but I believe they're more like scavengers who, taking advantage of Russia's agony and the fact that Putin can't get out of this war, are tearing off bigger and bigger pieces from Russia's body. So basically they count the population, considering India and China as their allies, add up the populations of these two countries and say, see, that's more than half. Half the world's population is for Russia. Well, that's Russian propaganda for you. Next, a statement from Donald Trump. Donald Trump said that Ukrainians want to go on the offensive. I will make a decision on this issue, meaning the Tomahawks, but they want to go on the offensive, and we will have to make a decision, says Donald Trump. I'm still curious, who influenced Donald Trump so much that, at least in his rhetoric, he changed his opinion like that? I mean, at first, he had an excellent relationship with Putin. I'll end this war quickly, just like that. 1, 2, and it's over. Then Donald Trump was dissatisfied with both Russia and Ukraine. There was such a period, and now Putin is a paper tiger. Russia can't capture anything, and the Ukrainians are even planning to go on the offensive. And then there's the personal insult to Putin. That's already quite a blow to... This is really, I think, at some point, Donald Trump put Putin in the loser category. And in the tough world of business, where Donald Trump came from, and really, he never left that world, no one feels sorry for the weak, especially Donald Trump. No one feels sorry for losers. So if as a child you nobly followed the rule, don't hit someone when they're down, believe me, Donald Trump would have kicked someone who's down a few more times, and hard enough that they'd really feel it. So if you're a loser, if you're a proven loser in Donald Trump's eyes, then... So take your nickname, Paper Tiger. And the moment when this turning point happened, I think it was around September 8th or 9th, when Donald Trump's 50-day ultimatum expired, during which, within that period, Putin was supposed to show at least some kind of result on the front. Well, yes, he did show something. And old Kabaev couldn't tolerate the personal insult either, and sent his half-liquid Terminator, Dmitry Medvedev, to personally threaten Trump with a nuclear strike. And Trump didn't let it slide either. Another statement, it's not even a statement, it's more like a direct message to Putin. Stop killing Ukrainians and stop killing Russians, said Donald Trump, addressing Putin. And now for news from the I've been saying this for a long time series. I've been talking about this for a while. I think those of you who have been watching this channel for a long time will back me up. It really did happen. Chernihiv will name a park after Donald Trump, and one of the city's parks is being renamed in honor of the US president. The decision was supported by 22 deputies at an extraordinary session. So I've said it 100 times. You know, from the outside it might seem absurd, but since we're in these circumstances, I've said 100 times that we should put in every city golden statues of Donald Trump, like protective charms, make a statement. Whoever bombs this city is bombing, in effect, the symbol of Donald Trump. You could even, create a separate mechanized brigade named after Donald Trump and ask the US president to help arm it. Well, with Donald Trump, only the very best. Of course, we shouldn't go overboard with golden tanks and Hummers, but let's say thank you for the long-range weapons. A separate mechanized brigade named after Donald Trump. The Ukrainian delegation in the US has already held a preparatory meeting with Marco Rubio. The purpose of this meeting was to synchronize their positions, to align the topics that will be discussed and their stances on these topics, and to prepare for the meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump, which will take place tomorrow on Friday. On the eve of this meeting last night, the Russians launched a massive attack on energy facilities and gas extraction sites in Ukraine. They struck the Sumy, Poltava, Kirovorad, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Chernihiv regions. In other words, more than 300 drones and about 40 missiles were launched across Ukraine. That is, the energy terror continues. Just before the start of this recording, guided aerial bombs were also launched at Ukrainian cities. In general, the fewer successes Putin has at the front, the more fiercely he strikes Ukrainian cities, hoping to leave Ukrainian homes, hospitals, kindergartens, and schools without heat and light this winter. It seems to me that even this alone could serve as a key argument for providing Ukraine with the necessary means. Long-range strike capabilities. In other words, Putin's Russia is no longer just a gas station. That is because the armed forces of Ukraine are depriving Russia's oil refining industry of capacity every day. So it's not a gas station anymore. It's simply become a raw materials appendage of China. That is, all of Russia relies on the sale of oil and gas. The war is also mainly about these resources. And over 25 years of rule, Putin has absolutely not diversified the risks, meaning he just mindlessly sold raw materials. Now he's selling them at much lower prices, having lost the European markets. Soon he'll be giving them away to China for next to nothing. So here we are. And you would think that Putin, who loves history so much, well, certain periods of it, who is always preparing some kind of historical references. Here's a recent bit of history for you, the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the key accelerators of that collapse was the fact that the USSR, just like Russia now, was hooked on the oil needle. Then oil prices started to fall, and they kept falling for several years. And the Soviet Union's economy couldn't take it. It cracked after a few years. That's an example, and it's really recent history. Putin lived through it. By the way, Putin himself called the collapse of the USSR the greatest tragedy of the century, but seeing what caused the collapse, what acted as the catalyst, he did exactly the same thing in Russia. For 25 years, he just sold raw materials. That's it. And by the way, I'm looking at the report from our general staff. In the past 24 hours, 1,080 Russian occupiers have been eliminated. How much do you have to hate your own people to dispose of them in such numbers? Let me remind you, the number of killed and wounded Russians has already surpassed 1 million. And by the way, Donald Trump recently mentioned a figure of 1.5 million. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union lost 15,000 people. For comparison, 1.5 million versus 15,000. That was the entire Soviet Union with all the republics that were part of it at the time, a much larger entity. Friends, let me remind you that Putin's offensive failed thanks to the fact that real heroes, defenders of Ukraine, are fighting on the front lines. And we are continuing an important fundraiser for the 101st Brigade to provide ground-based unmanned evacuators for wounded soldiers. That is, for 2 thermite systems for the 101st Brigade. These ground-based evacuators help save not only the life of the soldier being evacuated, but also the medics. The medics don't have to go out after the soldier, which could put them under fire. That's why this equipment is extremely important right now. And the soldiers have recorded an address for us. Please take a look.
Ми, бійці 101-ї бригади охорони, звертаємось до Бориса Тізенгаузена та його підписникам за допомогою. Ми дуже вдячні вам за раніше надані дрони. На сьогодні нам дуже потрібні 2 наземні роботизовані комплекси «Терміт» для швидкої і своєчасної евакуації поранених з поля бою, що у теперішній ситуації дозволить врятувати їх життя. Наші підрозділи воюють на Константинівському напрямку та Часовому Ярі. Продовжуємо нищити ворога і віримо в вашу допомогу. Слава Україні!
So, in this case, your donation directly saves someone's life, and for that, as always, I want to say a huge thank you, both from myself and from those for whom we are doing this. The link to donate is in the description of this video. There's mono, there's private, and there's PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. Let's push a little harder. I'm asking you, there's very little left to go, and if you don't see the link, here's a QR code. You can use it to donate as well. So Putin, who has imagined himself an emperor, what's happening now with the countries of Europe and the United States? Putin, who sees himself as some kind of historical figure, sometimes comparing himself to Alexander I, sometimes to Peter the Great or someone else, has launched the largest arms race in at least the last half century. And if there's anyone who doesn't need to be additionally asked to prepare for war with Russia, who fully understands what kind of neighbor they have to live with, it's Finland, which once went through a very similar experience with the Soviet Union as Ukraine is now going through with the Russian Federation. I'm talking about the Winter War, when the Soviet Union behaved just as aggressively as Putin's Russia does now, claiming that Finland was planning to attack the Soviet Union. They claimed the rights of Russian speakers were being violated. In general, we know exactly where Putin got his playbook from. So the Soviet Union went to war with Finland, but Stalin and his army broke their teeth there, just like Putin did against Ukraine. In the end, part of Finland's territory was occupied by the Soviet Union, but Finland preserved its independence and sovereignty, and in my opinion became even stronger. Now look at the regions that were occupied back then and are now part of the Russian Federation. And look at how people live in Finland. By the way, I absolutely love this country. I won't stop saying it every time I mention it. And Finland has built more than 50,000 bunkers, capable of sheltering almost the entire population of the country. Bild reports on this. Well, I think some of them weren't exactly built from scratch, but rather modernized. They've been renovated, meaning the shelters are equipped with gyms, playgrounds, parking lots, and even hockey arenas. They are located about 20 meters underground and can protect people even in the event of a nuclear strike. I think that after this war, all of Russia's reasonable neighbors need to come together and think about how to make Russia small again and remove its sting in the form of nuclear weapons. I mean, it's clear that after the war, Russia will rapidly decline. In one of our previous programs, we discussed that a financial crisis is one thing, but a financial crisis combined with a lost war, plus the loss of geopolitical influence, pariah status, and so on, is something else entirely. So let's just be honest. Even if something happens to Putin under the current state of affairs in Russia, the foundation of power there, it is an alloy of criminals, security forces and special services, oligarchs and the military. In a country where all of this forms the foundation, only another Putin can come to power after this. In a country where the so-called resource curse is at work, where there's no need to win the loyalty of citizens, and repression is unleashed. That is, where a small group called the O0 Cooperative has seized all the resources. Only a Putin 2.0 can come to power. Or they might not even bother much. Apparently there are plenty of these Putin replicants over there. So they'll tell fairy tales that Putin drinks birch bark decoction and has been living for 120 years without changing. Well, God forbid, of course. I hope that some revolutionary will hit him on his bald head with a snuff box so he can't cause any more trouble in this world. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Subscribers of this channel, Calm Analytics, have started to notice that if you get your neighbors hooked on Calm Analytics, the level of sanity in your building noticeably increases. So subscribe and get your friends to subscribe too. And if you hear from your parents or grandparents that the Carpathian Molfars and Dmitry Gordon said the war will end tomorrow, make sure to get them subscribed to this channel as well. Russia is preparing for the second phase of military aggression. This is all according to the Finnish Minister of Defense, who states that Russia is building up troops near the borders of the European Union and preparing for the second phase of aggression. And he is certain, the Finnish Minister of Defense, Antti Häkkänen, that even after the war in Ukraine ends, Russia will still pose a threat to Europe. Of course it will. Exactly. For exactly the reason I mentioned earlier. After losing a major war, in order to distract Russians from poverty and problems, a small victorious war will be needed. Now imagine for a second what will happen if hundreds of thousands of Russians who have gained experience handling weapons and are now receiving huge amounts of money by regional standards for this war. Just imagine that they all return to their homes. Their families have gotten used to seeing a very large sum, by regional standards, deposited on their cards every day. They've already gotten used to living like this, and then suddenly all of this comes to an end. There's no more money, but you hang in there, as Medvedev once said. So this is something Putin doesn't need. And you know, right, that Putin has emptied the prisons? He took everyone he could, not just for Wagner PMC. Former murderers, maniacs who honed their skills in the war, are already returning to Russia. Recently, I read an absolutely wild story that is very characteristic of today's Russia. There will be thousands and thousands of such cases. So, here's the story of a modern-day hero, in quotes, of the so-called special military operation, by the name of Kanakin. He was buried in the Saratov region just the other day. In 2010, he was convicted of murder. He served 9 years, and in 2019, he was released and almost immediately committed a second murder. More than 70 stab wounds to his drinking companion. So basically a relapse right away, literally. He was sent back to prison again. This Kanakin signs up with the Wagner PMC and goes off to, sanctioned by Putin, he goes to kill Ukrainians. Killing is what he loves to do. Well, at the beginning of 2024, he returns from the war, and soon after coming back, he kills his friend's girlfriend and beheads her. He gets arrested again, signs another contract, and goes off to war once more. And this time, the armed forces of Ukraine shot this monster dead, disposing of this human trash.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
In other words, the armed forces of Ukraine actually did a good deed for the Russians, even though there definitely won't be any gratitude in return. So all of these people, these Kanakins by the hundreds of thousands, are returning to their remote villages and small towns where poverty, decay, and depression await them. And then comes a sharp drop in income. Now just imagine what that's going to be like. Although, I don't know, maybe it won't look much different from the current situation, but at least all this madness will come back home. By providing Ukraine with Tomahawks, Trump wants to force Germany to hand over Taurus missiles to Ukraine as well. A very interesting insight from Kyiv Post. But as we know, there are forces in Germany's coalition government that are opposed to this. Their argument is that they don't want Germany to be directly drawn into the war. Basically, they stick to the policy of, oh no, let's not anger the paper rat. The transfer of Tomahawks could really change their position. Moreover, today there's news that naturally the programming will be done by American military personnel. So at this point, against this backdrop, what reasons are left not to transfer the Taurus? I mean, just like France is transferring Scalp missiles, Britain is sending Storm Shadow, the United States is providing Attack-MS. So what happened? Well, in general, yes. As always, I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who is helping Ukraine in this difficult war. A huge thank you to everyone. And now our traditional segment, Not a Day Without Fire. Sanctions from Magyar, the GUR, and the SPU. On the night of October 16th, Ukraine's defense forces struck the Saratov oil refinery, according to the General Staff. This is one of the oldest oil processing plants in Russia, and its capacity allowed it to process about 5 million tons of oil annually. Not the largest, but an important one. But what's important here is the systematic approach. Not a single night goes by without Ukrainian drones hitting some Russian oil refinery. They keep striking, and you can see the capacities keep dropping and dropping. At this point, more than 40% of processing capacity has already been knocked out. Well then, and here, I just couldn't pass by this news. One of Putin's deputies accidentally voiced out loud the formula for Putin's rule for the near future and how he plans to use Russians going forward. So, there's this State Duma deputy, Oleg Matveyev, who stated that in order to increase the birth rate, it's necessary to lower the standard of living of the population. The better people live, the fewer children they have. The highest birth rates are in those countries that are poor, and the lowest are where people are wealthy. And this is not a joke, just so you understand. He actually said that. So in general, it's a very interesting question. You could probably dedicate an entire program to how standard of living, religiosity, and education affect birth rates. So basically, the higher the income, the lower the birth rate. This, a universal relationship confirmed by demographic studies, is income per population. That is, rich countries, the 7, for example, have on average about 2 children per family. While the poor countries of Africa, those south of the Sahara, are 3 to 5 times larger. That is, the average indicator for children is 6. In general, to patch up the huge demographic hole that this war has torn open, Putin will have to make his population even poorer. But this will actually be a natural process, by the way. Then, with the help of the church now plays a key role to force Russians to have children. There will be a need to push, and they are already doing this now. The Russian Orthodox Church is already engaged in this. But there is another interesting factor that affects birth rate figures is women's education. That is, it is believed that in Europe a woman first studies, then builds a career, and only by the age of 30 does she make a decision whether to have a child or not, and so on. So by that time, if you don't study or build a career, you could already have had several children. As a result, those who make a conscious decision, they usually have 1 or 2 children. But for example, in Chad, the average age at first birth is estimated to be around 18 years old. That's the average age at first birth. In the EU, this figure is about 30 years old. The average age at first birth, so there's a gap of about 12 years exactly. But if a woman is forbidden or restricted from getting an education, as the Taliban do, for example, they justify it with a religious basis. Then there's no need to study, no need to build a career. The only purpose is to give birth, and guard the family hearth, basically. And Putin is now moving in this direction, so in the near future we can expect studies in Putin's Russia about how education supposedly has a harmful effect on women. So now they are, just imagine, right now at this very moment, they are trying in every conceivable and possible way, with the significant help of the church, plus new restrictive laws are definitely on the way, to forcefully compel Russian women to have more children. He's absolutely out of his mind. He truly has no real idea what he's actually doing or the profound implications of his actions. For him, it's just a biological resource. He needs people for the war. Sometimes I feel like it's just when he looks at those empty-eyed, Botoxed monsters. With those cheeks, I feel like he looks like that Emperor from Star Wars. I mean, it seems to me that he's already dead inside. He just needs resources, those resources. He feeds off them. That's the feeling I get. It's like some kind of lifeless creature. So yesterday, the president of Syria arrived in Moscow, Ahmed Shara. And naturally, one of the questions was to officially request the extradition of the fugitive Bashar Assad. And in Moscow, how do you respond to that? Do you refuse? Plus, they still want to discuss the military bases somehow. So what should they do? So for now, they managed to talk their way out of it. There hasn't been any official statement about handing Assad back, but we're expecting it. By the way, let me just remind you, when Assad fled Syria, his troops had been defeated there, and Russian media were writing that terrorists had come to power. Solovyov was there, and our Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sybiga, flew in and met with Ahmed Shara. And Solovyov wrote, look, he's shaking hands with a terrorist, and so on. Well, anyway, and now, my God, everyone is bowing down like this. And now, this is from the Kremlin's website. Negotiations took place at the Kremlin between Putin and the president of the Syrian Arab Republic, who is in Russia on a working visit. So he's not a terrorist anymore. Why is that? Syria is one of the most telling failures of Putin's foreign policy. When Russia rapidly began to lose influence, bogged down in the war with Ukraine, Putin was unable to help Assad or hold on to Syria. I think you remember how quickly things developed there. So the president of Syria, who came to Moscow on his own, is already the embodiment of the Kremlin geostrategists' incompetence. So Putin found himself in a very difficult situation. Either he has to give up his buddy who knows too much or find some other way to appease him. One of the topics they still plan to discuss is compensation for the destruction caused during the war. There's a problem here too, because Putin's budget is bursting at the seams because of the war. He has to find that money somewhere. And war is a very expensive business. But you know what's most interesting? That for Syria, Putin might actually find money to restore infrastructure and homes. But for Russians, he won't. For them, yes. For you, no. Well, besides, why bother? Let them be poorer, then they'll end up having more children, apparently. Putin will be rebuilding homes over there, while in the Kursk and Belgorod regions they've already said there's no money. Goodbye. That's the paradox. Well, everyone knows that Putin, he doesn't care as long as there's more cannon fodder. When I was preparing the material, I went to see how the Kremlin website presented this meeting with the president of Syria. First of all, they had some kind of breakfast or lunch. Here's a tip for the president of Syria. When visiting Putin, don't eat anything. The Botoxed pensioner can easily treat you to Novichok. And the second point, this is already a classic, is that the president of Syria is noticeably taller than Putin. And Putin has a serious complex about this. It's no wonder he keeps gluing those lifts to his shoes all the time. Do you want me to show you a photo from the Kremlin website, how the Kremlin photographers tried to smooth over this height complex? Take a look. The photographer was literally lying on the floor taking pictures from below so that the height difference wouldn't be noticeable. My God, how insecure he is. By the way, the Kremlin's pool of photographers actually has special instructions on how to photograph the balding jellyfish so that he doesn't look like the little twerp he actually is. Well, I think right now they're doing everything they can to convince the Syrian delegation, like, don't demand extradition, we'll sort it out, don't embarrass us, come on, otherwise our relations will suffer, we still want to use your bases, we want to give you money, and so on and so forth. But something could definitely happen. You know, despite what Putin says about we don't abandon our own, in reality, dozens of top managers from various oil and gas companies are being thrown right out of windows, and they fall as if by accident in huge numbers. So something could also happen to Assad here as well. In a case like this, with such secrets, he clearly won't live to see the trial. And you friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and let's support the fundraiser for our warriors from the 101st Separate Brigade. They really need it right now, and besides, there's very little left to go. Wishing us all a peaceful day, and of course, glory to Ukraine.